I can describe it as it felt like I was given a death sentence, and I felt useless and I felt hopeless. That's how it made me feel. So I lost my sense of purpose. We all need a sense of purpose in our lives, a reason to get up in the morning. And when I lost my job, I lost my sense of purpose as well.
So we're now live, Raja and Chris. Welcome everybody to this Facebook Live event, which is another carer clinic with Dr. Raja. My name is Sue Hines and I'm a speech and language therapist, head of service at Dementia Carers Count, and I will be hosting this session. You are probably used to, if you've been to these sessions before, that they are usually between Dr. Raja and myself, or Dr. Raja and another professional. And we're absolutely delighted today to have a third member of our team, Chris. Now, before we let Chris introduce herself, welcome Chris, I'm just going to ask Dr. Raja to set the scene for today's session and tell us a little bit about what people can expect as they're tuning into this.
Thanks, Sue. Welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining us. So thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. The theme that we are going to discuss today is about young onset dementias, which are very distinct to other types of dementias that all of us come across. It's worrying that about 40,000 people had young onset dementia at the start of 2010. We are projected to have at least about 50,000 people with young onset dementia by 2025. So it's an increasing population. 5% of all dementias diagnosed in this country belong to the category of young onset dementia. So we thought it would be appropriate to have a discussion about young onset dementia, and more importantly, have a person who has the experience of the illness and who's also had the experience of looking after someone with that particular type of dementia, and therefore we are very grateful to have Chris with us to bring that very important lived experience, carer experience, into discussing about this very important topic. On that note, I'm going to pass on to Chris to introduce herself, and thanks Chris once again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon everyone, my name is Chris Maddocks. And I'm living with dementia, but I've recently been a carer for a friend of mine who had Alzheimer's disease and breast cancer. And there's more complications when you're a carer living with dementia, looking after somebody with dementia. So I was diagnosed in 2016 with early onset vascular dementia. In 2018, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And in 2021, I was diagnosed with Lewy Body dementia. So that's briefly who I am.
Thank you, Chris. That's a great introduction for people. As you say, very complex situation for you, your own diagnosis of young onset dementia with 3 different types of dementia that have been identified, but also supporting somebody else through their dementia and other health conditions that person had as well. So thank you for that introduction. And Raja, as you said, the diagnosis rate is growing quite dramatically. There are far more people living with young onset dementia than I think often the general public are aware of, and we really wanted to bring the awareness of that to this session. A couple of things to say is that, Chris, I know you were happy for me to share with people that one of the things for with your diagnosis of dementia and the challenges that it gives you is you do sometimes take a little bit more time to process information, and sometimes you might need us to slow down. If you need me to slow down at all or repeat something, please do ask me to do it. And it's an important thing for people who are watching perhaps to take forward that message, that often someone needs shorter sentences, more time to process, and more time to actually get a response together to be able to respond. So we'll try to do that for you as much as possible in this session. As always, if anybody wants to put a question in the chat or make a comment in the chat, we'll have a look through those. We'll weave them into this session. Sometimes it takes us a little bit of time to sort of identify they're there or weave them into the appropriate point in the discussion. But please do message in if you'd like to do so, and we will take a look at those. And obviously, we know some people want to do that anonymously as well, so you can do the private messages as well. So just moving on to the main part of the session, we're going to split it into two parts really. One is around the challenges of diagnosis, and the second is around the complexities and challenges that once you've got a diagnosis that it can give to you in day-to-day living if you have diagnosis of young onset dementia. And just before we do that, Raja, I'm just going to ask you, can we just clarify for people the difference between young onset dementia and the term early? So we like to refer to young onset dementia as opposed to early onset dementia, don't we?
Yes. So, so conventionally speaking, young onset dementia is when the person has dementia under the age of 65 years, and they may still go on to live beyond 65 years, but still have the impact of dementia. And that is the type of dementia that that we are focusing on in particular today, because the living circumstances of someone who's under the age of 65 would be very different. Perhaps they have young families, they are still at work, their financial commitments are very different. Their physical health issues could be very different. They might still be physically active. Hence the reason I think why we need to be looking in particular at young onset dementia. And as you rightly said, the complexities in terms of diagnosis, but equally the challenges that people with dementia and their families face, which Chris will be helping us to understand in a better way.
Great, thank you. And we do usually at this point have you give us a case vignette from your day-to-day working life, but we're going to not do that today because we're so lucky to have Chris with us. And instead, I'd invite Chris, could you tell us a little bit about, I see you've got a cat in the background, that's lovely, she's about to cross, oh, she's going to cross the screen in front, I think. Some of the challenges that you had on getting to the point of your diagnosis.
Yeah, sure. Well, before my dementia diagnosis, I had 3 minor strokes between 2013 and 2015. And the strokes left me with some cognitive problems. And I had problems with my recall and recollection memory. So, and extreme fatigue. So I had quite a lot of time off on the sick. And then I was aware that my symptoms were getting worse. And I'll give you an example. I was living alone at that time, and I got up one morning and I couldn't remember how to get dressed. And there were 3 things I needed to do when I got up in the morning. One was to take my medication, make myself a drink, and feed my cats. I had 2 then, but sadly I've lost one of them. But I found myself walking around the kitchen and not actually doing anything. And then I got my medication in dosette boxes so I could see if, like, this morning's tablets are gone, I've actually taken them. And just lots of little things really, and I was forgetting to eat. So I went to my GP and I told her about these things. And my GP turned to me and said that she was there for my physical health and not my mental health. And in her opinion, there was nothing wrong with me. And I left their surgery in tears, because your GP is meant to be your first port of call.
I'm really sorry that happened, Chris. As you say, your GP is your first port of call. And I guess to some degree that must have made you feel you weren't listened to, and sort of your experiences weren't being taken seriously as a concern to your physical or your mental health. Yeah,
and they referred me to, said I was suffering with depression and anxiety, and referred me to Mind. And I did a course about depression with Mind, because I was at the point where I would have had help from anybody that offered it to me. But that wasn't the right place for me to be.
And I think what you've said, Chris, is you described those early symptoms that you felt that weren't related to the stroke. Yes, you'd had some strokes and they'd given you some recall and fatigue difficulties, memory difficulties. But these were new things that you were experiencing, such as being able to carry out those usual everyday tasks like getting dressed, a routine in the morning. And I think it's really valuable to share all those with listeners, because maybe it will help listeners to think, well, these are the sorts of things, if I'm observing them, to jot them down, because these are things that I can take to the GP and try and sort of get someone to listen to me. Raja, you've listened to what Chris has said. From the clinical perspective, when somebody who is under the age of 65 and they come to a clinic and are describing some of these difficulties, is it much more difficult to diagnose at that point?
Yes, Sue, and firstly, I'm very sorry, Chris, that you had this very difficult experience with your GP and then had to go through a diagnosis and treatment plan which wasn't readily related to the underlying brain condition that you've had since. In terms of diagnosis, diagnosing dementia in younger people is very complex. We are generally used to the idea of people presenting with memory problems as their kind of primary concern, but that may not necessarily always be the case in someone who's presenting with young onset dementia. They could be presenting with other cognitive problems. It could be problems with attention and concentration, which will then have a significant impact on their work life. And therefore they'll be finding it difficult to do the routine work that they would have been carrying on for years. They could also be presenting with a lot of other symptoms, non-cognitive symptoms of depression, for example, anxiety, irritability, poor sleep, apathy, or even presenting with things such as having a personality change, leading to a lot of conflicts in relationships and with their social interactions as such. So these kind of symptoms being present for a significant length of time and impacting on work or home tasks or relationships, they should be taken seriously and not just as a functional mental disorder like depression or anxiety is. And if people do present to their GP with these kind of symptoms, they should be referred to a memory clinic or an equivalent assessment service run by the mental health trusts. So they could have an in-depth assessment of their symptoms, including a full-on cognitive assessment and a brain scan, so we can understand and pick up the causal problem in an early stage, so we could start looking at ways to not just medication but other things that could be very helpful to the individual.
Okay, thanks, Raja. And I think both of you have discussed, actually, for Chris's experience and your experience in clinics, Raja, that, you know, there are so many different symptoms that go with any type of dementia, but often it's the rarer symptoms or the more hidden challenges that we see with young onset dementia. And you've mentioned a few of those. I think you mentioned the cognitive problems that impact on day-to-day life, anxiety, poor sleep, apathy. So we can see where, Chris, you perhaps got missent to an inappropriate treatment and mind, and we can see it. But I think this is where this is so important, because it opens up the conversation, hopefully for people in the future, has less of the time being pushed from pillar to post and not getting to see the people you need to see and not being heard properly. So hopefully this will help with that. So lots of challenges took place, and you did mention, Chris, when you started, that it was having an impact on your working life, and that's something really important to consider for lots of people with a diagnosis of young onset dementia. You're still in work, so
Yeah.
If we can, I'd like to turn to the impact of your dementia on your day-to-day life, and that might be pre-diagnosis or following your diagnosis.
Yeah, just to clarify, a lot of the other symptoms you mentioned, Raja, I also had apathy, problems with my sleep. I couldn't multitask anymore, and I was very good at multitasking. So there was lots of symptoms. And then one day I was having problems with my coordination and ended up in hospital, feeling I was having another stroke. And I was sent to the elderly care assessment unit. I was 60 years old, so even the name of that unit was awful. And I I had my diagnosis at that assessment, thinking I was just going for an assessment. Anyway, I was working full time, and I tried to go back to work just for short periods at first. And work threatened to dismiss me when I first went back. They didn't know what to do with me. They hadn't had anyone who'd had strokes or dementia. And then they decided that they'd put me on a disciplinary process. And that felt awful. Why was I in a disciplinary process? And I can remember just trying to get into my emails, and I couldn't remember the process of how to access my email account and lots of other accounts that I was using on a regular basis. And I'd be shown, and then 20 minutes later, I'd forget and I'd have to be shown again. And so I knew that there was something wrong. And cut a long story short, I was ill health retired against my wishes. And I didn't know at that time that they had a duty to make reasonable adjustments to me in the workplace. So in a 3-month period, I had my diagnosis and I lost my job. And then I went into a pit of depression for 3 months and didn't want to leave the house and just cried.
And again, sorry, Raja, carry on.
It has quite a devastating impact, isn't it, when the diagnosis is at such an age where you're still a very active socioeconomic member of not just the family, the society itself, and it's not uncommon that people with young onset dementia present with significant amount of depression post diagnosis.
I can describe it as it felt like I was given a death sentence, and I felt useless and I felt hopeless. That's how it made me feel.
Yeah, that feeling of uselessness and hope, and sort of almost being abandoned by the workplace as well. I mean, those words that you said were used, they are such negative words, aren't they? A disciplinary process, a threat of dismissal, and it just does spiral your own mental health when you're dealing with something that is a life-changing diagnosis in
And
itself as well.
Also, I lost my sense of purpose. We all need a sense of purpose in our lives, a reason to get up in the morning. And when I lost my job, I lost my sense of purpose as well.
Yeah, and our sense of purpose is really important to us. What about your identity as well, Chris? Did it impact that for you at all?
Yeah, very much so. I thought I wasn't the person that I used to be, and I never used to think of myself as Chris. I used to think of myself as Chris living with dementia, and I couldn't sort of just identify me as a person without adding the dementia tag, which people said to me, why are you doing that? Just identify yourself as Chris. So I think I lost the part of me that says I'm still me.
Okay, and that is such an important part for all of us. Raja, from a clinical perspective, Chris has mentioned lots of vulnerabilities there that she experienced, that you experienced, Chris, weren't there? The sort of social, emotional, psychological vulnerabilities that the whole thing has had for you, and I'm sure in some ways is still ongoing. In a clinical perspective, Raja, what would be the vulnerabilities you were looking for and sort of some action points for people?
So people with young onset dementia will be at high risk of self-neglect, risk of hopelessness turning on to having thoughts of self-harm. And because some of the symptoms such as irritability, change in personality can manifest in a way that people become very aggressive, and that can put themselves at risk, put other people at risk. And because they're still physically young, active, and may not be very insightful enough, then they might be at high risk of accidents when they're outside their home or when they're using appliances at work or at home. So driving related risks, for example. So the illness, because of the physicality that the body is still able to do, and the fact that they may not be very insightful, and it's very hard for people around, as Chris has made it evident, it's difficult for people to understand, even from a professional background, then it must be even more difficult for family or workplace to recognize. Then they will be at quite a significant vulnerability. I think health service and social care have a duty of care towards these people with young onset dementia, and where there are significant amount of concerns, risks, vulnerabilities, they should be on the safeguarding register to try and have a collective approach with the involvement of health and social care agencies towards providing a care plan that is comprehensive, holistic, and it's not purely illness focused, but more about trying to support the individual to carry on their socio-occupational performance as much as possible, and equally to try and support the young families, because it might be very difficult for a spouse or partner to take time off to be with the person with dementia. It will be very difficult for children, whether they're young or teenagers, to understand about why their parents are very different in their kind of interaction now to how they were previously. So they need quite a lot of support as much as the person with dementia. So it's about identifying the vulnerabilities, but also identifying the strengths, and then having that wider support to the person with dementia in the context of the home situation, as well as supporting them at work.
Thank you. And in a minute, I'm going to invite Chris to talk about perhaps what you feel needs to change in health and social care, because Raja, you have mentioned that. But just before we talk about that, and also, Chris, you mentioned at the beginning, you have had a unique situation where you've been a person who has dementia and caring for somebody else. And I know Dr. Raja and myself are keen to invite you back again, because that's a whole nother Facebook Live that, you know, we can't cover in the next 9 minutes. But for you, Raja mentioned about the impact on family members, because you have young onset dementia and those family members around you are perhaps that much younger as well. Is there anything you'd like to say about what you found has been really important for the people who care for you around you?
Yeah, I think that when I had my diagnosis, I wasn't given any information and I wasn't referred to any services, which I found out later was wrong and I should have been. So I sat at home and cried for 3 months, and eventually I rang up Alzheimer's Society to ask for help. And somebody came on that same day to talk to me and to give me some reassurance. And I went on a course called Living Well with Dementia that Alzheimer's Society was running. And it was for people newly diagnosed. And I would describe that as my lifesaver, because I was with other people who had recently been diagnosed with dementia. We laughed together, we cried together, we shared coping mechanisms, we shared difficulties, and it made me understand my dementia, and that's all I needed to do, was understand my dementia. And you say about, I used to be the most placid person in the world, but I found myself getting very agitated quite quickly for no reason. And I worked it out for myself, and I think it's because I was frustrated at some of the things I could no longer do. And that's why I was getting sort of cross. I wasn't cross at anyone else, I was cross at myself. So I think it's important to realize that there's an emotion often behind any sort of signs of aggression or irritability. There's an emotion behind that. And sometimes you might just want a hug. It might be as simple as that.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important message, that actually when you are having some of these emotions, that you're having some of these experiences, that it is driven by what a struggle it is for you, and that response and that change, the way that you react in, is an emotional response to a set of very challenging circumstances. And I love, Chris, that you've given us a really positive message there, that it's really important to reach out. And you did the Living Well course with Alzheimer's Society, and you were able to laugh, to hug, to cry, to share your experiences with other people, which is quite different to when you ended up in hospital that one time, and you ended up on a hospital ward, which was an elderly care ward, and you didn't have necessarily any identity with those people there. But you know, I think it's an important message to reach out to people who are perhaps in a similar situation, where you can share those stories, learn some information, learn why you're responding to different situations in the way that you're responding to them is really important. We are nearing the end, and I promised we were going to get your views on perhaps what you felt in terms of health and social care needed to change in the UK. I'm wondering if you could share a few thoughts on that.
Yes, I think that you know, very often it's been involvement and having an involvement in things, and a reason, as I say, to get up out of bed in the morning, a sense of purpose. And for me, doing those things, like things in nature, is what helps me. And I do go to a dementia cafe in the woods, and it runs every week, and we meet in the woods, and we do some activities, we cook on a campfire, and I just love that because that appeals to me. But very often, any activities that you want to do, there's a cost behind it. And I think that if we could be helped in some way, shape or form to do some form of, I don't know, art class or exercise class or something like that, it would make us feel better. And in the long run, it would save a lot of money for the NHS, because now if there's something wrong with people living with dementia, first thing they do is go to their GP or go to the NHS. If they felt better about themselves and better about their lives, and felt that you have got something to give, then I wouldn't, you know, not that I do that, but people wouldn't need to go to their GP, because they wouldn't need that reassurance, because they're doing things for themselves.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I think you've described lovely with your activities around some of these activities that need to be available. They do come at a cost, but they need to be age appropriate. They need to be the sorts of activities that really play to your strengths, rather than being an impairment-based reaction to something that's a challenge. It's to look at actually what can you do rather than what can't you do. And I think that's so incredibly important. Raja, have you any thoughts on this?
I think, firstly, I think activities and activity scheduling is very, very important, especially a combination of both physical and mental activities set at the ability of the person with dementia. We are lucky in Surrey because we've partnered with younger people with dementia Berkshire charity to provide that degree of activity, and it's working relatively well. But I'm aware that it may not be truly representative of the services across the country. So there is clearly a need for similar kind of services across the country, and I think we should prioritize that. And as Chris rightly said, those are the kind of things that would help increase confidence in people with dementia, support families, and try and maintain the familiar environment for the person with dementia for any length of time. So that is very important. Second thing that I would say would draw upon the previous session that we had with Liz coming to talk to us about positive behavior support plan, and the focus is on the strength of the individual. And we need to remember that younger people with dementia still have plenty of skills and still have plenty to offer to themselves, to the family, to the wider society, like how Chris is being very active in supporting a lot of causes around dementia itself. So I think we should understand their strengths. We should help them to build on their strengths, and the focus should be on how to utilize and make it more purposive, as Chris said. So I think that is going to be very important, and it's always important to remember that there is hope. And one of the things that I always remember is that there was this young gentleman with dementia who was admitted to my ward when I was a inpatient consultant psychiatrist. And I can remember the heartbreaking scene when two young children came to see him on my ward in their school uniforms just after work. The delight that they had on the face just before entering the ward that they were going to see their dad, and then there's no way to describe the sadness and the tearfulness with which they left when they walked out of the ward. And we need to understand that. We need to understand that we're talking about real people here, real families, young families who are devastated by the illness. And I just wanted to instill that sense of sadness, but also try and aspire for hope when I wrote my book, Away with the Fairies, which was about, again, a younger onset dementia, a gentleman suffering from it, and told through the point of an 8-year-old boy whose dad obviously has dementia. So I think we need to understand that young people with dementia still have the ability, and we need to understand that we need to support the younger families as they go through this very difficult process.
Right, and you know, it is unique. You do have many more younger carers, and health and social care perhaps needs to join up more with children's services to be able to take account of that. For listeners, so you mentioned that you have some specific services for people with young onset dementia in Surrey. I know in Sussex, there's an organisation called the Good Company People who do work to make group activities to be more appropriate and to build on people's strengths. But Dementia UK also has a Young Dementia Network, and it's really worth looking at the Young Dementia Network of Dementia UK, because they will be able to know what's going on in your own local areas and provide you with a lot of the support Chris, you said was really important about being around other people who get the experience that you're having. It does bring us to the end of our Facebook Live session. All I can say is so many thanks to Chris for joining us and talking about your own personal experience, and to Raja again for all the wisdom and knowledge and experience that you bring to these carer clinics. Just to remind everyone, we have a new campaign starting on Monday the 16th of October, and that's our campaign called Walk in My Shoes. We're encouraging people to walk as much or as little as you want, maybe to walk in some silly footwear or to somewhere different, really to raise awareness for people of the needs of family carers and people with dementia. And if you are near Surrey and you are near Dr. Raja's hospital, he is going to be trying to wear a pair of red high-heeled shoes for the day, aren't you, Raja?
Yes, and I tried them on early this week, and I've never done anything more uncomfortable in my life for my feet. So it'll be an experience.
And I am sure we'll see some photos of it at some point. But on a sort of more serious note, it's a bit of a fun activity. It's to make us all step outside of our comfort zone, know what it's like perhaps to be doing things that are challenging for you on a day-to-day basis. And if you can take part, you can sponsor friends to take part, then it will help us to raise awareness and much needed funds so that we can continue to provide lots of services to family carers. And some of that is around some of our courses, which really get down to some of the nitty-gritty subjects that we often don't like to talk about. We put on courses such as thinking about transitions into full-time care home or on continence, and distressed behaviours. Chris, you were talking about how your behaviours have changed, so helping people really understand why that happens. You had your penny drop moment, and we really want to help other people to have those penny drop moments as well. So get out any crazy shoes you've got, follow Dr. Raja. Maybe he'll be a bit of a Dorothy with shiny red shoes and click his heels and create some magic. But thank you everyone for joining us again. Do go to our website, do have a look what's there. And again, thank you both so much.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.